The wind moved first, sliding through the iron-bark trees of northeastern Victoria with a low, whispering moan. It carried the damp smell of soil and rotting leaves, the sharp tang of gun oil, and the nervous scent of horses tied too tightly to their posts. Somewhere in the darkness, a branch snapped, dry and sudden. Every man heard it. Every man froze. Constable Thomas Lonigan sat near the campfire, his rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the black wall of bush beyond the firelight. The flames cracked softly, sending sparks upward, but the warmth did nothing to slow the chill crawling up his spine. The bush was never quiet, yet tonight it felt wrong, as if it were watching them. "You hear that?" Constable Michael Scanlon whispered, leaning closer to the fire. Lonigan didn't reply. His jaw tightened. He had been a policeman long enough to know when fear was more than imagination. For weeks, the Kelly gang had been haunting these districts, striking without warning, vanishing without trace. Men said they moved like spirits, that they knew every gully, every stand of trees. Lonigan told himself such talk was nonsense. Still, his fingers trembled slightly on the rifle stock. Behind them, Constable McIntyre checked the horses again, patting a neck, murmuring nonsense words meant to calm both animal and man. Senior Constable Kennedy stood apart, staring into the dark, his silhouette rigid and alert. A kookaburra laughed somewhere far off, its echo sharp and mocking. Lonigan spat into the dirt. "Damn birds," he muttered. "Sound like the devil himself." None of them laughed, beyond the ring of firelight, for figures lay low among fallen timber and long grass. Their breaths were slow, measured, controlled. Edward Ned Kelly pressed his cheek to cool earth, eyes fixed on the glowing camp ahead. Firelight flickered across his beard and the brim of his hat. He felt the familiar weight of the revolver in his hand, the rough wood of the grip worn smooth by years of use. Beside him, Dan Kelly shifted slightly, easing stiffness from his leg. Joe Byrne adjusted his rifle, metal clicking softly before he froze, listening. Steve Hart lay motionless, eyes open, mouth set in a thin line. They had been tracking the police since sunset. Every step, every pause, had been deliberate. This was their land. They knew its sounds, its moods. Tonight the bush was tense, coiled tight. Ned leaned back just enough to whisper, "No shooting unless you have to." Dan glanced at him, surprised. "They won't hesitate." Ned's eyes stayed on the camp. "Neither will we. But we don't need more blood than this already carries." The fire flared. A shadow rose. Lonigan stood and stretched, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "I'll take a look around," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. Kennedy nodded. "Don't wander far." Lonigan stepped beyond the firelight, boots crunching softly on gravel. His heart beat faster with every step, but he told himself it was foolishness. Just trees. Just night. Then a figure stepped out of the darkness in front of him. Lonigan jerked his rifle up. "Ned Kelly," he said, voice sharp with forced bravado. "You're under arrest." For a fraction of a second, the world held still. Then gunfire ripped through the bush. Lonigan fired first. The shot thundered, echoing between the trees, the bullet smashing into bark inches from Ned's head. Ned's revolver answered instantly. Lonigan screamed as he fell, clutching his leg, blood soaking into the dirt. The camp erupted in chaos. "Horses!" someone shouted. Scanlon ran toward the noise, rifle raised, eyes wide. Another shot cracked through the night. Scanlon dropped where he stood, his body collapsing without a sound. Smoke drifted thick and bitter. Horses screamed and tore free, their hooves pounding like thunder as they vanished into the bush. McIntyre fired blindly into darkness, each shot louder than the last in his ears. "Where are you?" he yelled, panic breaking through his training. Ned stepped forward into the firelight, smoke curling around him. His face was calm, almost solemn, illuminated by the flames. "Lay down your arms," he called. "No one else needs to die." Lonigan writhed on the ground, his screams ragged and desperate. "Shoot him. Don't let him take us." McIntyre's finger tightened on the trigger. His hand shook. For a moment, he couldn't tell where the voice of duty ended and terror began. That hesitation was everything. Steve Hart surged from the shadows, slamming into McIntyre's side. The rifle flew from his hands. Dan was on him in an instant, revolver pressed close, breath heavy and fast. "Don't move," Dan said quietly. "Just don't." Kennedy tried to raise his weapon, but a shot from Joe Byrne tore through his chest. He staggered back, surprise etched across his face, then fell into the dirt beside the dying fire. The bush fell silent again, broken only by Lonigan's sobs and the crackle of burning wood. Ned moved through the scene slowly, eyes taking everything in. 2 men dead, 1 wounded, 1 shaking with shock. He knelt beside Lonigan, meeting his gaze. "I told you to surrender," Ned said. Lonigan spat blood. "You'll hang for this." Ned stood. "Maybe." They bound McIntyre and left him alive. When they disappeared into the trees, the night swallowed them whole. McIntyre ran at first light. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave way, until the image of Ned Kelly standing in the firelight burned itself into his mind. Not grinning, not savage, just tired. When he reached Mansfield and told his story, fear spread faster than fire through dry grass. Newspapers screamed of murder and rebellion. Rewards were posted. Politicians demanded action. Armed patrols marched north, boots heavy, rifles gleaming. The colony had declared its war. Deep in the bush, Ned Kelly sat by a small fire, sharpening his knife. Sparks jumped with each scrape of steel. Joe Byrne stared into the flames. "This won't end clean," Joe said. Ned nodded once. "No war ever does." The fire crackled, and beyond it, the bush waited. Dawn came thin and gray over the ranges, seeping through the mist like a reluctant witness. The bush looked peaceful in the early light, but the ground told another story. Broken branches churned soil, dark stains soaking into the earth. By the time the first search party reached Stringy Bark Creek, the birds had fallen silent. Sergeant Steele dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the damp ground. He took in the scene without speaking. 2 bodies lay where they had fallen. Faces pale, eyes open, uniforms torn and filthy. Nearby, the ashes of the campfire still smoldered. "Jesus," one trooper whispered. Steele crouched, fingers brushing the dirt. Bullet casings glinted in the grass. The fight had been close, fast, brutal. Not a chaotic brawl, but something planned, executed. "These men weren't ambushed by fools," Steele said finally. "They were outmaneuvered." Word spread quickly. Within hours, telegraph lines carried the news to Melbourne. The deaths of Kennedy and Scanlon ignited outrage. Newspapers printed Ned Kelly's name in thick black ink, calling him a murderer, a monster, a traitor to the crown. A reward was announced, then doubled. Special constables were sworn in. Rifles were issued. Orders were simple and absolute. Bring him in, dead or alive. In the bush, the Kelly gang kept moving. They traveled at night, slipping through gullies and creek beds, covering their tracks with practiced care. Dan favored the high ground, always watching their back trail. Steve scouted ahead, ghost quiet. Joe carried the news, gathering whispers from sympathizers who still saw the gang as victims of injustice rather than criminals. Ned listened to every report in silence. "They're bringing in more men," Joe said one night, voice low as they crouched near a small fire hidden by rocks. "Police from Melbourne. Better guns. Better horses." Ned stared into the flames. "They always think that'll be enough." The pressure closed in. Police patrols crisscrossed the ranges. Settlements were searched. Homes were raided. Women were questioned harshly. Children watched as rifles were pushed through doorways. Each act of force hardened the lines. One afternoon, the gang spotted patrol moving through open country. 6 troopers riding in a loose line, rifles slung but ready. Ned studied them from a ridge, eyes calculating distance and wind. "We don't need this fight," Dan murmured. Ned nodded. "No, but they need to know we're still here." A single shot rang out, sharp and echoing. Dirt kicked up near the lead horse. The troopers scattered instantly, dismounting, returning fire toward the ridge. Bullets snapped overhead, tearing leaves and bark. Ned and his men were already moving, sliding back into cover. disappearing into the bush as if they had never been there. The message was clear. The hunt would not be easy. At night, Ned lay awake listening to the bush breathe around him. He thought of his mother, of the weight of the law pressing down on his family. He thought of the men who had died at Stringy Bark Creek, and of the men now marching toward him with rifles and orders. "This is bigger than us now," he said quietly one night. Steve glanced over. Always was. The next clash came near a small homestead at Wombat Ranges. Police had been tipped off. They moved in cautiously, spreading out, boots crunching softly on dry leaves. Ned heard them before he saw them. The bush always warned him. A shout, a shot, chaos. Gunfire thundered between the trees. Smoke hung thick, stinging eyes and throats. A trooper cried out as he fell, dragging himself behind a fallen log. Dan fired twice, controlled. Precise. Steve circled wide, flanking, forcing police to turn and split their attention. Ned stood his ground longer than he should have, firing steadily, drawing their focus. "Move, Ned!" Joe shouted. A bullet tore through Ned's coat, close enough to burn his skin. He retreated at last, heart pounding, lungs burning as they vanished once more into the bush. When the firing stopped, the police were left with wounded men and no prisoners. Anger followed fear. Orders grew harsher. The reward grew again. Public opinion split down the middle. In cities, Ned Kelly was a villain, a threat to order. In the bush, he became something else. A symbol. A man standing against a system that had crushed so many before him. Ned didn't speak of symbols. He spoke of survival. "We can't keep running forever," he said as they rested near a creek, washing blood and dirt from their hands. Every step they learned more. Dan frowned. "Then what do we do?" Ned looked north, toward Glenrowan, toward rail lines and telegraph wires and the heart of colonial power. An idea had been forming, dangerous and desperate. We forced them to face us on our terms. The bush was changing. Patrols moved faster. Scouts learned the land. Each day brought closer calls, shorter escapes. One night, as rain hammered down and thunder rolled overhead, Ned felt the weight of it all pressed down on his chest. "This ends one way," he said into the storm. "Either we're dead or we're remembered." The rain swallowed his words, but the truth of them lingered in the dark. The rain eased just before dawn, leaving the bush slick and steaming. Water dripped from leaves in a steady rhythm, like a slow clock counting down. Ned Kelly rose first, muscles stiff, boots heavy with mud. He listened. No shouts, no hooves, just the distant rush of a swollen creek. They had survived another night. Joe Burns stirred the fire back to life, keeping the flames low. Steve Hart scanned the tree line, rifle resting across his knees. Dan Kelly rubbed his hands together, eyes red from lack of sleep. "They're closer," Dan said quietly. "I can feel it." Ned nodded. He felt it too. The patrols were tightening, moving with more confidence now. The police had learned to read broken grass, disturbed stones, the subtle signs that once belonged only to men of the bush. The advantage Ned had relied on since boyhood was shrinking. By midday, they reached a ridge overlooking open farmland. Smoke curled from chimneys in the distance. Roads cut pale lines through the green. Telegraph poles marched toward the horizon like sentinels. Joe shaded his eyes. "That's Glenrowan way." Ned stared long and hard. "A crossroads," he murmured. "Rail, telegraph, roads. Everything the colony needs to move." Steve looked at him sharply. "You're thinking big." "I'm thinking final," Ned replied. They moved carefully into the outskirts of a small settlement as dusk fell. Here, the air smelled with smoke and livestock instead of damp leaves. Dogs barked, then quieted. Windows glowed faintly with lamplight. Ned pulled his hat lower, shoulders hunched, every step measured. The first man they approached was a railway worker locking up a shed. The man froze when he saw them, eyes widening. "Easy," Ned said calmly. "We don't want trouble." The man swallowed hard. You're Kelly." Ned nodded once. "We need food, horses, and your word you won't raise the alarm tonight." Fear warred with something else in the man's eyes. Recognition. Sympathy. "I won't," he said finally. By nightfall, Ned had gathered more than supplies. He gathered information. Trains were running heavy with police. Reinforcements were being rushed north. Telegraph lines carried his name day and night. "They think they can corner us," Joe said as they regrouped outside town. "They can," Ned replied, "unless we stop them moving." The plan took shape in fragments, spoken softly, refined with each whispered argument. Derail the police train. Take hostages to force negotiation. Make a stand so bold the colony would have to listen. Dan frowned. "It's madness." Ned met his eyes. "So is running until they shoot us in the back." They moved again before dawn, following the rail line north. The steel tracks gleamed cold in the early light. Ned crouched beside them, running his fingers over the bolts. "The sleepers, the curve ahead." "Here," he said. "This bend." Steve nodded. "Driver won't see it until it's too late." They worked quickly, muscles straining as they loosened the rails, stacking sleepers across the line. Sweat ran down Ned's back, despite the cold. Each metallic clang sounded too loud, too final. By sunrise, it was done. They retreated to Glenrowan Inn, taking it without resistance. Inside, the smell of beer, sweat, and fear filled the air. Ned moved among the guests, voice steady, reassuring. "No one here is hurt if no one does anything foolish." Some cried. Some stared at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. One man whispered prayer. Outside, Joe cut the telegraph wires. The sharp snap echoed like a gunshot. Silence followed. Glenrowan was cut off. Hours passed slowly. Ned paced, checking windows, listening for distant engines. He spoke quietly with Dan, with Steve, with Joe. Between them, unspoken understanding settled in. There would be no easy escape this time. As evening fell, a strange calm came over Ned. He sat alone for a moment, hands resting on his knees, eyes unfocused. This is where it ends, he thought. Not with a chase through the bush, but with a stand, a line drawn in iron and blood. Outside, the rails waited. Somewhere far down the line, a train was moving north, steam building, wheels turning. The colony was coming, and Ned Kelly was ready to meet it. Night settled heavily over Glenrowan, thick and close, pressing against the walls of the inn like a living thing. Oil lamps flickered inside, their yellow light trembling with every sound. The hostages sat huddled together, murmuring prayers, clenching hands, eyes darting toward the doors and windows. Outside, the rail line lay dark and silent, sleepers stacked across the track, like a crude barricade against the future. Ned Kelly stood near the front window, watching the road. Every sense was stretched thin. He could hear the rasp of his own breathing beneath the distant chirring of insects, could smell fear mixed with stale beer and smoke. This was no longer the bush. There was no room here to vanish. Joe Byrne came in quietly from outside, rainwater dripping from his coat. "Telegraph's dead," he said. "No messages in or out." Steve Hart checked his rifle again, fingers methodical. "They'll still come." Ned nodded. "Of course they will." Time dragged. Each minute felt heavier than the last. Ned moved among the hostages again, speaking softly, offering water, telling them to keep low when the shooting started. Some listened. Some couldn't stop shaking. A young railway worker stared at Ned with something close to awe. "Is it true," he asked, voice barely above a whisper, "that you're wearing armor?" Ned's mouth twitched. "Soon." In a back room, pieces of iron lay spread across the floor, plowshares hammered and bent, edges rough, surfaces scarred. Dan crouched over them, strapping sections together with leather and wire. Joe helped, hands blackened, breath quick. "It's heavy," Dan muttered. "It'll stop bullets," Ned replied, lifting the breastplate. It clanged softly, dull and solid. He slid it over his head, the weight settling onto his shoulders, pressing down. The metal was cold against the skin. Steve whistled low. "You look like a bloody ghost." Ned tested his arms, adjusting the helmet. The slit narrowed his vision, turned the world into a tunnel. But when he raised the plate, The sound was unmistakable. Iron on iron. Final. Far down the track, a faint vibration crept through the ground. Ned felt it through his boots before he heard it. A distant rumble. Steam. Steel wheels. "They're coming," he said. The sound grew louder, a deep, rhythmic thunder rolling toward them. Hostages cried out. Someone screamed. Ned raised his voice, calm but commanding. "Everyone down. Now." The police train burst around the bend, engine blazing, whistle screaming. At the last moment, the driver saw the obstruction. Brakes shrieked. Sparks flew. The train lurched violently, metal screaming as wheels left the rails. Carriages slammed and twisted, glass shattering, men thrown from their feet. Silence followed, thick, stunned silence, then shouting. Police poured from the wreckage, rifles snapping up, boots crunching on gravel. Their lanterns swung wildly, beams cutting through smoke and steam. "Kelly," a voice shouted, "come out and surrender." Gunfire erupted without warning. Bullets tore into the inn's walls, splintering wood, shattering windows. Hostages screamed and pressed themselves flat to the floor. Ned fired back from the doorway. The recoil thudding into his shoulder, shots deliberate and controlled. "Keep low," Joe yelled from behind the bar, firing through a shattered window. Steve moved like a shadow along the side wall, flanking, forcing the police to spread out. Dan fired from an upstairs window, muzzle flash lighting his face with each shot. The police advanced cautiously now, shocked by the derailment, confused by the darkness. Then they saw Ned. He stepped out into the open, iron armor gleaming dully in the lantern light. Bullets struck his chest and helmet with sharp clangs, sparks jumping as if from an anvil. He kept walking. "Christ almighty," one trooper gasped. "He's made of iron." Ned fired as he advanced, each step slow, relentless. The armor weighed on him, pulled at his neck and shoulders, but held. He could feel the impacts, solid punches against his body, but no pain followed. Police fire faltered. Men hesitated, backing away instinctively. "Shoot his legs," someone shouted. A bullet tore through Ned's thigh. Pain exploded white-hot. He staggered, but did not fall. He fired again, jaw clenched, vision narrowing further. Inside the inn, the fight was just as brutal. Bullets punched through walls. Smoke thickened, choking. Joe cried out as a round grazed his arm. Dan shouted something Ned couldn't hear over the gunfire. Minutes stretched into hours. The night was lit by muzzle flashes and burning debris. Men fell on both sides. Orders were shouted, lost, repeated. Fear ruled everything. At last, dawn began to creep in, a pale gray light bleeding into the smoke. Ned stood alone in the open now, armor scarred and dented, blood soaking his leg. His breath came hard and loud inside the helmet. A final volley rang out. Ned felt a heavy blow to his arm, then another to his shoulder. His revolver slipped from numb fingers. He tried to take another step and collapsed to one knee. Police rushed him, cautious even now, rifles trained on his chest. Someone kicked the revolver away. Hands grabbed at the armor, fumbling with straps. When they pulled the helmet free, steam rose from Ned's face into the cold morning air. His eyes were bloodshot, his beard matted with sweat and smoke, but his gaze was steady. "It's over," an officer said, voice shaking. Ned Kelly looked past him, toward the shattered track, the ruined train, the broken dawn. "Yes," he said softly. "It is." Morning light spread slowly across Glenrowan, revealing the full cost of the night. Smoke drifted in thin, exhausted ribbons from the wrecked train. The inn's walls were torn and blackened. Windows shattered. The ground around it churned into mud and blood. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some still, some groaning softly as stretcher-bearers moved among them. Ned Kelly was dragged clear of the battlefield and laid on his back, the iron armor stripped away piece by piece. Each plate hit the ground with a dull, final clang. Without it, he looked suddenly smaller, just a wounded man wrapped in torn clothing. His leg bled freely, the wound ugly and deep. A police surgeon knelt beside him, cutting away fabric, pressing cloth to flesh. "Don't bother," Ned muttered through clenched teeth. "I won't bleed polite for you." The surgeon ignored him, hands working fast. Nearby, officers gathered, staring as if expecting the man to rise again. "Is he dead?" one asked. "No," another replied. "Not yet." As Ned was lifted onto a stretcher, he turned his head, searching the smoke-filled ruins. His eyes found Joe Burns' body near the inn, face pale, hair dark with blood. A flicker of pain crossed Ned's face deeper than any wound. "Joe!" he whispered. No one answered. Dan Kelly and Steve Hart were gone. Their bodies would be found later, burned in the ruins. The truth of their final moments left to speculation and rumor. Ned said nothing as he was carried away. His jaw set. His war was finished. The reckoning was only beginning. He was transported under heavy guard, rifles bristling from every angle, to Benalla and then to Melbourne. Crowds gathered wherever the train slowed, faces pressed close, shouting curses or prayers, sometimes both. Some wanted to see the monster. Others wanted to see the man. Ned lay on a stretcher in the prison infirmary, feverish, drifting in and out of consciousness. Dreams came unbidden. His childhood flashed before him. Open fields, horses running free, his mother's voice calling him home. Then the bush again, dark and endless, gunfire echoing through the trees. When he woke, iron bars framed his world. The trial was swift and merciless. The courtroom was packed, air thick with sweat and anticipation. Judges in black robes looked down at him, faces carved from stone. Charges were read: murder, rebellion, outlawry. The words blurred together. Ned stood when ordered, leaning heavily on a cane. His leg would never fully heal. He listened as witnesses spoke, as policemen described the night at Glenrowan, as McIntyre's voice trembled recounting Stringy Bark Creek. When it was Ned's turn to speak, the room fell silent. "I do not deny what I have done," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "But I deny that I am the only criminal in this room." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. "I was born into a system that hunted my family from the start. We were poor, Irish, and marked. I fought back the only way I knew." The judge cut him off. "This court is not interested in politics." Ned nodded slowly. "That's the problem." The verdict was never in doubt. Guilty. The sentence followed like a hammer blow. Death by hanging. In his cell, Ned sat alone, the sounds of the prison echoing endlessly. Keys, footsteps, distant voices. He wrote letters with a steady hand, to his mother, to friends, to anyone who might listen. In them, he did not beg for mercy. He spoke of injustice, of pride, of regret. On the morning of his execution, the sky over Melbourne was pale and cloudless. The gallows stood stark against it, with freshly cut rope coiled neatly. As guards led Ned out, a murmur rose from the gathered crowd. Some shouted abuse. Others fell silent. The noose was placed around his neck. The hood followed. "Do you have any last words?" the hangman asked. Ned's voice carried clearly. "Such is life." The trapdoor fell. The body swung once, then stilled. In the days that followed, the colony tried to move on. Newspapers declared the end of the Kelly menace. Politicians praised the return of order. But the bush did not forget so easily. Stories spread of iron armor, of defiance, of a man who stood against impossible odds. Songs were sung in whispers. Children played at being Ned Kelly, pots on their heads, sticks for rifles. History argued over him. Criminal or hero, murderer or rebel, lawbreaker or symbol. What remained undeniable was this: a poor boy from the bush had forced an empire to look at itself. And in doing so, he had paid the highest price. The war was over. The legend had just begun. Time did not soften the memory of Glenrowan. It sharpened it. In the weeks after Ned Kelly's execution, the smoke of the burning faded, the twisted rails were replaced, and the bullet scars on walls were patched over with fresh timber. To the authorities, the wound had been sealed, order restored. But beneath the surface, something restless remained. In the bush, men spoke of the final stand in low voices around campfires. They argued details, corrected one another, added pieces they had only heard secondhand. Some swore Ned had walked straight into rifle fire like something unearthly. Others said he laughed as bullets rang off his armor. Each retelling pushed him further from flesh and bone, closer to myth. Police patrols continued for months, long after there was no one left to hunt. Rifles still crossed saddles. Boots still crunched through scrub. It was as if the force itself feared that if they stopped moving, the ghosts of the Kelly gang would step out of the trees. Constable McIntyre never returned to the north. He carried Stringy Bark Creek with him wherever he went. At night, he woke sweating, the crack of gunfire echoing in his ears, the image of Scanlon falling replaying without mercy. He told no one, but the war had not ended for him. In Melbourne, Ned Kelly's body was buried quietly without ceremony. There was no marker, no acknowledgement beyond a name in a ledger. Officials believed that forgetting him was the final victory. They were wrong. Pamphlets began circulating, copied by hand, retelling Ned's words from courtroom. His letters were read aloud in kitchens and shearing sheds. Lines were memorized, repeated, argued over. The phrase, such as life, took on a life of its own, spoken with bitterness, with pride, with resignation. For the poor and dispossessed, Ned became proof that resistance was possible, even if doomed. For others, he was a warning of what chaos looked like when the law lost control. Australia split not by geography, but by belief. Years passed. Children grew into men who had never seen Ned Kelly, yet spoke of him as if they had. Ballads were written, melodies drifting across paddocks at dusk. Painters tried to capture him, always failing to agree on his face. Writers turned him into a symbol, sanding away contradictions, or exaggerating them until a man beneath disappeared. The truth lay somewhere messier. Ned Kelly had been violent. Men had died by his hand. He had chosen the path of the gun. But he had also been shaped by a system that offered him little mercy and less opportunity. Both truths existed, uncomfortable and inseparable. Historians would later sift through court records, police reports, personal letters. They would argue over intent, over fairness, over whether another ending had ever been possible. Some would claim the armor was proof of madness. Others would call it ingenuity born of desperation. What none could deny was the scale of the response he provoked. A single bushranger had forced the full machinery of colonial power into motion. Special police units, trains, telegraphs, public trials. The war against Ned Kelly had revealed the fear beneath authorities' uniform. Even the police changed. Training improved. Tactics evolved. Glenrowan became a lesson taught quietly. Never underestimate a man who has nothing left to lose. Decades later, travelers would stop near the old site of the inn. They stood in silence, imagining the night, the steam, the shouting, the clang of bullets on iron. Some felt awe. Some felt sorrow. Some felt anger. The land absorbed it all without comment. Ned Kelly did not live to see what he became. He did not see his face printed on stamps, his armor displayed behind glass, his name invoked in debates about justice and rebellion. He did not hear scholars argue whether he was Australia's first freedom fighter or its most famous criminal. He only knew the weight of iron on his shoulders, the burn of bullets, the certainty that his story would end violently. Yet in death, his story refused to end. It lingered because it asked questions no colony was ready to answer. Who does the law serve? What happens when justice feels unreachable? How far can a man be pushed before he pushes back? Ned Kelly's war was not just fought with rifles in the bush. It was fought in courtrooms, in newspapers, in memory. It was fought long after the last shot was fired. And that is the cost of such conflicts. They do not stay buried with the dead. They echo forward, shaping how a nation understands courage, defiance, and consequence. The bush has grown quiet again. Trees stand where blood once soaked the soil. But on certain nights, when the wind moves just right through iron bark leaves, it still sounds like footsteps. Such is life. Years slid by, but the echo of gunfire never fully left the country. The bush healed on the surface, green returning to scarred ground, trees growing tall where men had fallen. Yet memory does not obey seasons. It settles into places, into people, into the way stories are told when night comes and work is done. In the police barracks, Glenrowan became a cautionary tale. Veterans spoke of it to recruits in lowered voices, not to glorify the fight, but to warn against arrogance. They described the derailment, the confusion, the fear of facing an enemy who refused to break. Some admitted, quietly, that for a moment that night, the law itself had felt fragile. Among settlers and laborers, the tone was different. Ned Kelly's name was spoken with familiarity, sometimes affection, sometimes anger. Men argued over him while sharpening tools or sharing drinks. One would call him a killer. Another would answer that killers were often made, not born. No one ever fully won those arguments. Ned's mother, Ellen Kelly, carried the weight of it all in silence. She aged quickly, grief carving lines deep into her face. The law never stopped watching her. Even after Ned's death, suspicion clung like dust. Yet when neighbors came quietly with food or help, she accepted without pride or shame. She had lost a son to a war she never chose. In Melbourne, artists began to reinterpret the story. Stage plays reenacted Glenrowan with exaggerated heroics. Audiences gasped as an actor in crude iron armor strode across wooden boards under fake gunfire. Applause thundered. Critics argued whether this was remembrance or exploitation. The armor itself became an object of fascination, displayed behind glass. It looked smaller than people expected. Heavy, scarred, imperfect. Children pressed their faces close, imagining what it must have felt like to wear it, to walk into bullets believing iron could carry you through fate. Few consider the pain underneath, the fear trapped inside that narrow slit of vision. Scholars picked apart every decision Ned had made. They traced a chain of events backward. Land disputes, police harassment, prison sentences, resentment passed from father to son. They asked whether reform, not force, could have changed the ending. Their papers filled journals. Their conclusions never fully aligned. Out in the bush, such debates felt distant. What remained there was simpler. Ned Kelly had stood. He had refused to run forever. Whether that made him noble or foolish depended on who was speaking. Old men told children about the night sky, glowing with gunfire, about the sound of bullets striking iron like hammers on an anvil. The children listened wide-eyed, absorbing a version of history shaped by voice and firelight rather than textbooks. Not all memories were romantic. Families of the dead policemen carried their own burden. Wives raised children without fathers. Names were etched into stone. For them, Ned Kelly was not a symbol, but a man whose actions left permanent absence. Their grief rarely made it into ballads. This was the other cost of war. No story belonged to only one side. As Australia moved toward federation, questions of identity grew louder. What did it mean to be Australian, separate from the empire that governed them? In that conversation, Ned Kelly appeared again and again, an uncomfortable mirror. He represented defiance, but also division, independence, but also violence. Some embraced him as a rough, flawed ancestor of resistance. Others rejected him as a stain best left behind. The debate itself became part of the national character, argument as inheritance. Decades later, when the Bushranger era faded into distant history, Ned Kelly remained stubbornly present. Films were made, each claiming truth while bending for drama. Some portrayed him as a folk hero wronged by authority. Others emphasized blood and brutality. None fully captured the man who existed between those extremes. Perhaps that was inevitable. History prefers clean lines. Ned Kelly lived in contradictions. He believed in loyalty and family, yet brought destruction to both. He spoke of justice, yet used violence. He resisted oppression, yet became an oppressor in the eyes of others. These tensions refused to resolve neatly, and so his story endured. Standing at Glenrowan today, it is difficult to imagine the chaos that once consumed the place. Trains pass smoothly. The land appears ordinary. But history is not erased by normality. It waits beneath it. The real legacy of Ned Kelly is not found in armor or slogans. It lies in the questions his life still forces upon anyone willing to look closely. How far should obedience go? When does survival become rebellion? What is the price of standing alone against a system that cannot bend? His war ended on a gallows, but its meaning never settled. And perhaps that is why, more than a century later, his name still travels the wind through the bush, refusing silence, refusing conclusion. As the decades stretched on, Ned Kelly's shadow lengthened rather than faded. Australia changed around it. Towns grew, railways spread, cities rose, but the story endured, reshaped by each generation that touched it. What had once been breaking news hardened into legend, and legend into argument. School books struggled with him. Some editions reduced him to a footnote, a dangerous criminal dispatched by the law. Others lingered longer, acknowledging the grievances that fed his rebellion. Teachers learned quickly that mentioning his name could split a classroom, stirring inherited loyalties and quiet resentments passed down like family heirlooms. In rural districts, the past felt closer. Old stations still bore bullet scars. Tracks through the bush followed routes once used by troopers and outlaws alike. Elderly men pointed out ridges where police once camped, creeks where horses were watered. Memory clung to geography. Tourists came, cameras in hand, searching for something tangible. They wanted proof that the stories were real. Guides spoke carefully, balancing entertainment with respect, aware that they were standing on ground where men had died. Not all visitors listened. Some treated it as spectacle. Others fell quiet without quite knowing why. The legal system, too, could not escape the legacy. Lawyers cited Kelly-era policing as an example of unchecked authority. Reformers pointed to mass arrests, collective punishment, and the criminalization of poverty. Opponents answered that the colony had faced armed rebellion and responded as any government would. The argument replayed endlessly, each side convinced history was on its side. Ned Kelly himself remained elusive within it all. The more that was written, the harder he was to see clearly. Every author chose a version of him, emphasizing certain traits while discarding others. The angry outlaw, the principled rebel, the reckless fool, the victim of circumstance. None were complete. What is known is simpler and more troubling. Ned Kelly lived in a time when the law often spoke with a heavy hand and listened poorly. He grew up watching his family humiliated, surveilled, punished. Each injustice hardened something in him. Each act of resistance narrowed his options. By the time he chose armor in open battle, he was already trapped by momentum, his own and the colony's. Glenrowan was not just an ambush. It was a declaration that there would be no quiet surrender, no fading into obscurity. That decision sealed his fate. Yet even in defeat, he forced those who defeated him to reckon with their methods. The spectacle of armored defiance shook confidence. The deaths of policemen raised uncomfortable questions about leadership and preparedness. The trial exposed the limits of colonial justice when faced with public scrutiny. In this way, Ned Kelly lost a war, but influenced its aftermath. Artists continued to return to him because his story refused closure. Painters depicted him faceless behind iron, a symbol more than a man. Writers imagined his inner thoughts, trying to bridge the distance between myth and reality. Musicians sang of the bush, of injustice, of last stands, letting melody carry what facts alone could not. Each interpretation said as much about its creator as about Kelly. By the mid-20th century, Australia was redefining itself on the world stage. The empire loosened its grip. New wars came, far bloodier and further from home. Against that scale, the Kelly gang seemed small. And yet, the questions they raised felt familiar. Authority, resistance, sacrifice. Veterans of later wars sometimes spoke of Ned Kelly with unexpected respect. Not because he was right, but because he understood what it meant to face overwhelming force knowing the odds. Courage, they knew, did not guarantee virtue. It only proved resolve. Standing before his armor in a museum, one feels the silence of an ending. The dents are real. The metal is unforgiving. It does not glorify. It simply endures. Ned Kelly did not win freedom for his people. He did not overthrow a system. He did not live to see reform. What he did was expose fractures that already existed, making them impossible to ignore. His life reminds us that wars do not always come dressed as wars. Sometimes they begin as disputes, escalate into hunts, and end in executions. Sometimes they are fought not between nations, but between a man and the world that shaped him. That is why the story persists. Because beneath the legend, beneath the arguments and imagery, lies a human truth that refuses to be silenced. When justice feels unreachable, defiance can become destiny, and destiny once chosen, demand a price that echoes far beyond a single lifetime. The passage of time did what bullets could not. It slowed the fury, softened the edges, and allowed distance to grow between a man and the moment. Yet even as the years rolled forward, Ned Kelly's presence lingered in the national consciousness like an unresolved chord, never quite settling into harmony. In courtrooms long after his death, judges still reference the Kelly era when speaking of public order and rebellion. It became shorthand for what happened when authority and grievance collided without restraint. Lawmakers studied the aftermath, quietly acknowledging that brute force alone had failed to erase the problem it sought to crush. In rural Australia, families passed down stories that did not appear in official records. Tales of police raids that came before the Kelly gang ever fired a shot, of doors broken at night, of men hauled away on thin evidence. These stories did not excuse what followed, but they explained how resentment took root. Ned Kelly grew up inside that resentment. By the time he carried a rifle, it already shaped his worldview. He believed the law was an enemy, not a protector. That belief guided his choices, narrowing every road ahead until confrontation felt inevitable. What made his story endure was not simply violence, but intention. He wrote letters. He made statements. He wanted his actions to be understood, not dismissed as banditry. In doing so, he challenged the colony to see him not just as a criminal, but as a product of its own failures. The challenge was uncomfortable, and discomfort rarely produces consensus. Some historians argue that Ned Kelly sought martyrdom, that Glenrowan was designed not to win but to be seen. They point to the armor, the hostages, the theatrical defiance. Others argue he hoped genuinely to derail authority, to force negotiation or expose corruption. The truth likely lies between desperation and calculation. What is certain is that Glenrowan transformed everything. Before it, Ned Kelly was a wanted man. After it, he was an idea. Ideas are harder to kill. Children learn him through stories filtered by parents' beliefs. In some homes, he was spoken of with admiration. In others, his name was followed by silence. This division mirrored broader tensions within Australian society, between city and bush, power and poverty, law and lived experience. As Australia matured, it began to examine its own past more critically. Colonial policing, land seizure, class prejudice. Subjects once avoided entered public discussion. In those debates, Ned Kelly appeared again, a symbol of resistance born from injustice, yet flawed by bloodshed. Museums curated exhibits carefully, aware that every caption carried weight. They displayed his armor alongside police rifles, his letters beside court transcripts. Visitors were left to decide for themselves. This balance reflected a growing understanding that history rarely offers simple heroes or villains. Popular culture continued to wrestle with him. Films cast handsome actors in the role, softening rough edges. Others went the opposite direction, emphasizing brutality and chaos. Each generation remade Ned Kelly in its own image, projecting contemporary values backward onto a 19th century life. Through all of it, the man himself remained partly obscured. The real Ned Kelly had laughed, worried, doubted, and feared. He had loved his family fiercely. He had made terrible choices. He had walked into gunfire knowing it would likely kill him. That knowledge is what separates legend from fantasy. He was not ignorant of the cost. He accepted it. For descendants of those involved, the story was never abstract. It lived in surnames and inherited wounds. Reconciliation between perspectives took time and, in some cases, never came. Pain does not fade evenly. Standing at Glenrowan today, with trains rushing past and tourists snapping photographs, it is easy to forget that this place was once the center of a small war, not declared by governments, but felt by everyone it touched. That war did not reshape borders or topple regimes. Its impact was quieter but lasting. It influenced how Australians talked about authority, about fairness, about when resistance becomes tragedy. Ned Kelly's legacy endures not because he triumphed, but because he forced a reckoning. He compelled society to confront its own contradictions, to acknowledge that law without justice breeds rebellion, and rebellion without restraint breeds suffering. In that sense, his story is less about one man and more about a cycle. a cycle that repeats whenever power forgets the people it governs. Such stories do not belong to the past alone. They wait, patient and warning, for each new generation to decide whether it has learned anything at all. By the time the 20th century approached, Ned Kelly's story had become inseparable from the Australian identity. He was no longer merely a bushranger who had challenged authority. He had become a lens through which Australians examined justice, rebellion, and resilience. Every retelling, every artistic interpretation, every debate about his life carried more weight than a simple recounting of facts could manage. The bush itself seemed to remember him. Tracks and creeks, ridges and gullies, all whisper the night at Stringy Bark Creek and the stand at Glenrowan. Farmers spoke cautiously when near those old sites, as if acknowledging that the past lingered beneath the soil. Travelers, curious and wide-eyed, were guided carefully to the remnants of that time. The site of the inn, the rails, the small clearings where gunfire had once shattered the night. Some saw only scenery. Others felt history pressing down, heavy and insistent. Scholars continued to debate his motives. Some argued he was motivated purely by self-preservation, reacting to a system that had hunted his family mercilessly. Others suggested a more calculated strategy, that Ned had seen himself as a man forced into myth-making, deliberately using spectacle and defiance to inspire fear and admiration alike. Both perspectives held fragments of truth. The man had been human, capable of strategy and error, courage and desperation. Artists and writers expanded the legend further. Stage plays dramatized the final confrontation. Films immortalized the iron armor, while novels filled in imagined dialogues and interior thoughts. Musicians composed ballads celebrating cleverness and daring. Each adaptation took liberties, turning real events into narrative devices. Yet in doing so, they preserved the tension, the sense that Ned Kelly had lived, moved, and acted under circumstances that were at once ordinary and extraordinary. But the cost remained. Glenrowan was not just a victory or defeat. It was a human tragedy. Families mourned policemen. Families mourned gang members. Ellen Kelly carried the burden of her son's deaths into her own passing, a quiet witness to the consequences of both law and rebellion. The police officers' descendants remember the events as the loss of fathers and brothers. The bushranger's legacy carried not only admiration, but grief, fear, and anger. Even the legal system bore traces of the Kelly era. Policies shifted. Police forces trained more rigorously. Officers were taught to anticipate unconventional tactics. The derailment and the ironclad defiance became case studies. Lessons were extracted, not to glorify the outlaw, but to prevent repetition. Yet these lessons carried an unspoken acknowledgement. A man with nothing to lose can challenge the mightiest institutions and leave them shaken. The legend also carried with it questions that refused resolution. Was he a hero or villain? A criminal or a symbol of resistance? Could the course of events have been different if opportunity, mercy, or understanding had existed in the colonial system? These questions circulated in public debate, in literature, in classrooms, in private conversations. Each generation shaped Ned Kelly to its own concerns, emphasizing defiance, courage, or violence depending on contemporary fears and ideals. For children growing up in rural Australia, the tale was part of everyday imagination. They mimicked his actions with sticks as rifles and tin lids as armor. These enactments were playful, yet they transmitted deeper lessons: loyalty, bravery, cleverness, and defiance. They were absorbing a myth, but also learning the weight of choices and consequences. Ned Kelly, in this way, became more than a man. He was a touchstone, a story that allowed Australians to explore questions of identity, morality, and power. He was admired, vilified, debated, and remembered. And while the armor in the museum might remain still and cold, the life it once protected continued to speak through history, art, and conversation. Yet the more time passed, the more the human beneath the legend was obscured. It became easy to forget that behind the myth had been a boy who learned early that survival depended on cunning, courage, and defiance. Behind the armor had been a man who loved fiercely, acted impulsively, and paid dearly for each decision. He had been clever and reckless, empathetic and brutal. To reduce him to icon or outlaw alone would be to lose a lesson that lived between those extremes. Standing at the site of the Glenrowan Inn, the imagination can trace the sequence of moments that ended in chaos. The shouted warnings, the firelight on walls, the clash of iron and lead, the smoke rolling up into the night sky. One can see the determination in Ned Kelly's stance, the careful coordination of Joe Byrne, Dan Kelly, and Steve Hart. And one can feel the fear, the pain, the certainty that death could come at any moment. It is a tableau frozen in memory, not just fact. And yet, even as the physical traces faded, the story did not. It survived in discussion, in scholarship, in song. It survived in the moral questions it raised. How much resistance is justified when laws are unjust? How far can courage carry a man before it becomes recklessness? How do we balance admiration for bravery with condemnation of its consequences? Ned Kelly's life and the bloody crescendo at Glenrowan remind us that history is never neutral. It is messy, contested, human. It is written by survivors, shaped by storytellers, debated by scholars. And yet, even when the facts are filtered, the human truth persists, the weight of choices, the inevitability of consequence, the cost of standing against overwhelming power, such as the legacy of Ned Kelly, a life that ended violently, yet continues to challenge, provoke, and inspire, a story of defiance and tragedy, of courage and consequence, that refuses to be silenced, refusing to settle neatly into the history books, insisting instead on being remembered in all its complexity. By the middle of the 20th century, Ned Kelly had transcended his own lifetime. The iron armor, once a crude shield in the hands of a desperate man, had become an artifact of fascination. Museums displayed it behind glass, but visitors, school children, tourists, historians, felt its presence as something heavier than metal. It symbolized audacity, ingenuity, and the perilous cost of defiance. In small towns across Victoria, tales of the Kelly gang were retold with reverence or fear. Some spoke of them as rebels against an oppressive system. Others remembered only the blood spilled in the bush. Stories shifted depending on who told them, yet certain images persisted. The gleam of iron under fire, the train derailed at Glenrowan, the courage of men who fought knowing the odds were impossible. Writers continued to explore his life, striving to reconcile myth with man. Novels depicted his childhood, highlighting the poverty and prejudice that shaped him. Letters he had written were republished and analyzed, each word dissected for insight into his motives and temperament. Journalists revisited the old police reports, looking for truth behind the spectacle. Scholars debated endlessly. Was he an outlaw, a folk hero, or something in between? The public's fascination with Kelly was not just historical. His story became a prism through which Australians examined justice, authority, and rebellion. Schools taught about him cautiously, aware that the lessons were nuanced. Discussions often moved beyond mere facts, touching on ethics and responsibility, loyalty, and courage. He became a figure whose life forced reflection on the human cost of societal failure. Even politicians reference him, invoking his story as an example of the consequences when law enforcement overreaches or neglects its duty. The railway derailment, the daring of the bushrangers, and the iron armor were cited as both a cautionary tale and a testament to human ingenuity. Yet few could separate the man from the myth entirely. Cultural interpretations multiplied. Film portrayed him as heroic, tragic, or ruthless. Ballads and folk songs carried his name across generations. Each retelling emphasized different aspects: defiance, courage, cruelty, or victimhood, but all agreed on one point. Ned Kelly had forced society to notice him, and once noticed, he refused to be ignored. In rural communities, his story retained a sharper edge. Old stockmen would point to ridges and creeks, recalling skirmishes and ambushes with vivid detail. Even decades later, locals whisper the nights when the bush seemed alive with the memory of gunfire, of men who had faced authority with nothing but iron and resolve. Children played games reenacting the ambushes and the daring escapes, learning courage, strategy, and caution in equal measure. Yet the narrative was not without its darker aspects. Families of the slain police officers carried the pain forward. Memorials recorded names. Their grief remained tangible. History did not absolve their suffering, and while the legend celebrated daring and defiance, it also reminded people of the ultimate cost. Lives lost, families broken, and innocents caught in the crossfire. Ned Kelly's mother, Ellen, passed quietly, her life marked by the shadow of her son's actions. She had endured the law's scrutiny, the loss of family, and the public scrutiny of her son's choices. Her grief embodied the human consequences of rebellion, ordinary lives shattered by extraordinary events. Her resilience, though less celebrated, was part of the legacy that history could not ignore. Across Melbourne and beyond, debates continued. Was Ned Kelly a product of an unjust system or an agent of chaos? Could his fate have been altered if circumstances had been different? Scholars examined court transcripts, police statements, and letters, attempting to piece together motive and consequence. The truth, they realized, was messy. Courage and brutality existed in the same moments, and heroism often walked hand in hand with tragedy. For Australians, the Kelly story became a touchstone for understanding their own society. It highlighted the tension between authority and the individual, between law and justice. It explored loyalty and betrayal, courage and recklessness, morality and survival. The story's endurance was rooted not in glamorization, but in its ability to provoke thought and reflection across generations. Even as urbanization spread and the bush became less wild, the Kelly legend maintained its presence. Historical societies preserved documents and artifacts. School projects encouraged analysis, encouraging students to question, interpret, and discuss. Films and books reminded each generation anew of the man in iron, whose choices resonated long after the gunfire had ended. The human element remained central. Ned Kelly had been capable of empathy and loyalty, fear and rage, calculation and impulsiveness. His choices were shaped by circumstance, yet fully his own. The armor, the train derailment, the stand at Glenrowan, all were tangible manifestations of human ingenuity and desperation, yet beneath them lay vulnerability, pain, and mortality. Ultimately, Ned Kelly endured as both man and symbol. The legend preserved the memory of courage, of rebellion, and of sacrifice, but also cautioned against the cost of defiance. Lives were lost, families destroyed, and the law tested. The Bushranger era ended in blood and ruin, yet its lessons persisted, quietly shaping the way Australians understood their history, their law, and their national identity. And through it all, the iron plates remained, cold, scarred, silent, a reminder that even in defeat, a man's choices can echo across time, leaving questions to those who follow. How far would you go for justice? What is the price of standing against the world? And what remains when the battle is done? The story of Ned Kelly continued to evolve as Australia itself changed. Urban sprawl swallowed the edges of bush, and the wild ridges where he had moved like a shadow grew quiet with the passage of time. Yet the echoes of his life, iron, gunfire, and defiance, remained embedded in the land, in memory, and in culture. Historians and writers alike were drawn to him, not merely because of his notoriety, but because his life embodied contradictions that could never be fully reconciled. He was simultaneously a criminal and a rebel, a symbol of resistance and a cautionary tale of hubris. Each generation interpreted him differently, projecting contemporary values onto a 19th century life marked by survival, desperation, and calculated risk. In the small towns of Victoria, the stories remain vivid. Older men remember their fathers recounting the days when the Kelly gang roamed the bush, and the fear that settled over communities was palpable. Children listened wide-eyed to tales of iron-plated men standing against police, of clever escapes, and of the final stand at Glenrowan. Some lessons were about courage, some about cunning, and others about consequences. All were framed in human terms. Decisions with weight, mistakes with cost. Museums and exhibitions grew more sophisticated, displaying artifacts alongside contextual histories. Ned's armor, battered and dented, stood as both a shield and a symbol. Guns recovered from the bush, letters from imprisoned associates, and court transcripts provided a fuller picture, though no display could fully convey the human experience of the man who wore the medal. Visitors left not with simple admiration or condemnation, but with reflection on courage, defiance, and the cost of standing alone against authority. Cultural interpretations continued to flourish. Novels explored his childhood, tracing the lineage of oppression that shaped him. Stage plays recreated the chaos of Glenrowan, complete with sound effects, smoke, and props meant to simulate the weight of iron. Films dramatized the narrative, shifting the focus to heroism, tragedy, or brutality, depending on the filmmaker's perspective. Folk songs spread across the countryside, carrying his story in verse and melody. Each retelling kept the story alive, but none could fully capture the complexity of the man himself. Debates over morality persisted. Scholars dissected his letters and courtroom testimony, seeking motive, intent, and ethical clarity. They argued whether he had been driven primarily by vengeance, survival, or a broader sense of justice. They examined the systemic pressures that shaped his decisions, noting police harassment, land disputes, and the social marginalization of Irish Australians. The conclusions were never unanimous. The truth was too complex for simple labels. Even descendants of those affected by his actions carried the weight of history. Families of the police officers killed at Stringy Bark Creek and Glenrowan grieved silently, their pain often absent from the retellings of heroism or defiance. Similarly, the Kelly family bore the scars of loss and public scrutiny. Ellen Kelly, long past, had left behind a legacy of endurance, reminding Australians that courage and suffering often exist in parallel, even within the same family. Ned Kelly's story was inseparable from questions about justice and authority. He had challenged colonial law, but he had also taken lives. The dichotomy forced Australians to confront uncomfortable truths, that laws, however codified, may be unjust, that rebellion carries consequences beyond personal survival, and that courage is not always heroic in the eyes of others. These lessons remained relevant as the nation matured, entering wars abroad and facing internal debates about equity, fairness, and identity. The bush, once a theater of conflict, slowly became a landscape of memory. Trains ran safely along rebuilt tracks, the smoke of locomotives replacing the echoes of gunfire. Yet in the quiet of dawn or dusk, when wind rustled through ironbark and wattle, the stories lingered. Tourists and locals alike would pause, feeling, perhaps, the weight of history pressed lightly against the present. The armor itself remained iconic, a physical reminder of ingenuity and defiance. Visitors marveled at its weight, the ingenuity of its construction, and the courage required to wear it into battle. They imagined the clang of bullets against iron, the strain on his shoulders, the narrowed vision behind the helmet slit. The resolve required to face a force vastly superior. The image of a man armored in metal became a universal symbol, the human desire to survive, to resist, and to leave a mark. Yet behind every artifact, every retelling, lay the human story, a man navigating impossible choices, confronting fear and violence, loving family, and dying under the weight of consequence. The myth and the man were intertwined, but they were not identical. Understanding Ned Kelly required acknowledging both the legend and the human cost it concealed. Over time, the story's endurance demonstrated the enduring power of historical memory. It was not simply the events themselves, but their interpretation and retelling that shaped public consciousness. Each song, book, film, and lecture carried forward lessons about courage, consequence, and rebellion. Each person who visited Glenrowan or examined the armor became part of the chain of remembrance, connecting past and present. And so, even decades after the last shot was fired, the story persisted, not as entertainment alone, not merely as history, but as a reflection on human nature. Ned Kelly's life decisions and final stand at Glenrowan remained a mirror in which Australians could see themselves, their courage, their flaws, and the difficult choices that define humanity. In that way, the Kelly legend was less about one man and more about the society that created him, challenged him, and remembered him. His life was a study in courage, ingenuity, and consequence. His death was a lesson in the price of defiance. And his memory endured because it compelled each generation to ask the same questions. How far will we go to protect what is ours? When is rebellion justified? What is the cost of standing against overwhelming power? Even now, walking to quiet remnants of bush, one can almost hear it. The faint echo of steps across ridges, the distant crack of gunfire, the metallic ring of bullets striking iron. The land remembers, as do the stories, as does history itself. And in that memory lived the complexity of Ned Kelly, a man of flesh and blood, a figure of legend, and a symbol whose meaning continues to evolve with time. By the latter half of the 20th century, Ned Kelly had fully entered the realm of legend, yet the man remained vivid in the details that survived. His life was dissected in textbooks, dramatized in films, celebrated in folk songs, and debated in courtrooms long after the last rifle had fired. The fascination was not merely with the crimes he committed or the law he defied, but with the complex humanity behind the armor and the myth. Historians increasingly focus on context. They examine the colonial structures that shaped him, the surveillance of Irish families, land disputes, discriminatory policing, and the limited options available to those at the margins of society. They traced how small injustices compounded over years, influencing choices that eventually led to violence. Glenrowan was no isolated incident. It was the inevitable climax of decades of tension, fear, and oppression. Art and literature continued to reinterpret the Kelly saga. Plays portrayed the armored figure with dramatic flourish, capturing the clang of metal and the terror of bullets striking iron. Films alternately glamorized his courage and emphasized the consequences of his actions, blending fact with legend. Ballads and folk songs circulated widely, each line carrying the tension of moral ambiguity. Heroism and cruelty intertwined, defiance and tragedy inseparable. In rural Victoria, local memory retained a sharper edge. Elderly residents recounted how the Kelly gang had moved through the bush, their movements precise and deliberate, their choices guided by both desperation and strategy. They spoke of nights illuminated by gunfire, of the whistle of the derailed train at Glenrowan, and of the terrifying figure of a man encased in iron. These stories were more than nostalgia. They were moral lessons, cautionary tales about courage, loyalty, and consequence. At the same time, the descendants of those involved in the conflict carried the weight of history in silence. Families of slain policemen mourned in private, their grief absent from songs and stories that glorified bushrangers. The Kelly family bore scars of its own, shaped by public scrutiny and the violent deaths of sons. Ellen Kelly's life, marked by endurance and sorrow, reminded Australians that courage and suffering often exist in parallel, even within the same household. Public debate about Kelly's legacy remained contentious. Was he a criminal, a rebel, or both? Could his life have ended differently if society had offered fairness and opportunity? Scholars examined trial transcripts, police reports, and letters to reconstruct motives and consequences. Each generation arrived at its own interpretation, shaped by contemporary ideals of justice, rebellion, and morality. Despite urbanization and modernization, the landscape of the bush still carried echoes of the past. Trails where the gang had ridden, creeks where horses had been watered, ridges where ambushes were staged, all remain points of memory. Visitors today may see only trees and tracks, but the stories persist, carried in the wind, whispered through leaves, and passed down through families. The iron armor, preserved in museums, serve as a tangible connection to the man behind the legend. Its weight, dense, and craftsmanship spoke of both ingenuity and desperation. Visitors could imagine the thunder of bullets striking metal, the strain on his shoulders, and the courage required to advance under fire. The armor was not glorification. It was a reminder of human vulnerability and resilience, of the peril inherent in choices made under duress. Ned Kelly's story also became a lens through which Australians examined broader societal issues. The tension between authority and individual autonomy, the consequences of systemic injustice, and the price of defiance were recurring themes in literature, scholarship, and political discourse. His life posed uncomfortable questions. When does rebellion become inevitable? How should society respond to those who are cornered by circumstance? What is the human cost of resisting authority? As decades passed, the story of Glenrowan remained a powerful metaphor. The derailment of the train, the shootout, and the final confrontation symbolized more than historical events. They represented a collision between an individual's will and the machinery of colonial power. Even when stripped of context, the image of a man in iron confronting rifles resonated as a story of courage, audacity, and inevitable consequence. Yet beneath the legend lay the human truth. Ned Kelly had lived, loved, feared, and acted. He had been capable of empathy and cruelty, of strategy and impulsiveness, of loyalty and defiance. His choices were shaped by circumstance, yet entirely his own. The myth of iron and bullets could never fully capture the man who endured pain, bore responsibility, and faced death with resolve. The enduring fascination with Kelly reflected more than historical curiosity. It revealed a national preoccupation with morality, justice, and identity. Australians projected their own values and anxieties onto the figure, interpreting him as a hero, a villain, or a cautionary symbol. Each interpretation reflected contemporary concerns as much as historical realities, ensuring that the story remained alive and relevant. In this way, Ned Kelly's legacy extended beyond his life and death. It was preserved not only in artifacts and records, but in collective memory, cultural representation, and ongoing debate. The choices he made, the courage he displayed, and the consequences he faced continue to provoke reflection on human nature, societal structures, and the cost of standing against overwhelming power. The bush, once a theater of his conflict, remained a silent witness. Trails, ridges, and creeks carried a memory of movement, strategy, and struggle. Even as modern life encroached, the landscape retained echoes of the past, reminding visitors that history is not only recorded in books and museums, but felt in place, atmosphere, and story. And so, the man and the legend endured together, intertwined, inseparable, and infinitely complex. Ned Kelly's life, choices, and final stand at Glenrowan continue to challenge Australians to confront questions of justice, courage, and consequence. His story was a mirror, reflecting both human potential and human flaw, a narrative that refused to be simplified, sanitized, or forgotten. In the end, the weight of history rested not solely on the armor, the bullets, or the battlefield, but on the questions he left behind. How far would you go for justice? When does rebellion become inevitability? What is the cost of standing against the world? And is the price worth paying? The answers remain contested, just as the man who inspired them remains vivid, enduring, and unforgotten. The story of Ned Kelly, decades after his death, had become inseparable from the Australian psyche. His life, choices, and the chaos of Glenrowan were studied, debated, dramatized, and remembered not merely as history, but as enduring questions about courage, law, and consequence. Each retelling added layers of interpretation, shifting emphasis between heroism and criminality, defiance and tragedy. In rural Victoria, the bush still remembered. Travelers and locals alike paused at ridges and creeks, tracing the imagined movements of the gang. Stories were told and retold by older residents, each adding detail, emotion, or interpretation. Nights around fires were filled with whispered accounts of iron plates ringing against bullets, of the derailed train trembling on scorched tracks, of a man standing resolute as lawmen closed in from every direction. These narratives were moral, practical, and emotional lessons all at once, reminding listeners of courage, loyalty, and the cost of resistance. The armor, preserved behind glass in museums, remained a focal point. Visitors marveled at its construction and weight, imagining the strain it imposed, the narrowing of vision, the courage required to advance under fire. But the metal was more than artifact. It was a symbol, a tangible reminder that human ingenuity and resolve can confront overwhelming force, even at the cost of life. Yet it also reminded them that bravery alone cannot change destiny. The consequences of choice are inexorable. In classrooms, Ned Kelly's story continued to provoke reflection. Teachers guided discussions about morality, justice, and societal inequality. Students debated whether his actions were justified, considering both the systemic pressures that shaped him and the human cost of his decisions. The story served not only as history, but as a vehicle for exploring ethics, law, and the complexity of human behavior. Cultural interpretations multiplied. Films alternated between glorifying his courage and emphasizing brutality of his choices. Novels explored the psychology of the man behind the legend, imagining the fear, loyalty, and determination that drove him. Stage productions recreated the chaos of Glenrowan, the thunder of bullets, the smoke-filled rooms, and the decisive moments when life and death hung in balance. Ballads and folk songs carried his story into homes and communities, blending narrative with rhythm, embedding history and memory. Scholars and historians continued to probe his life, examining trial transcripts, letters, and eyewitness accounts. Debates about motive and morality persisted. Some argued he was primarily a product of injustice and oppression, responding with desperation to systemic persecution. Others contended that his actions were calculated, that Glenrowan was as much spectacle as strategy, a final act designed to make a statement, to assert defiance even in defeat. Both interpretations held elements of truth. The human being beneath the armor was neither purely villain nor pure hero. He existed in contradiction, as real people often do. The descendants of those involved carried history in their bones. Families of policemen lost at Stringybark Creek or Glenrowan mourned silently, their grief less celebrated than the legend. The Kelly family bore the consequences of public scrutiny, loss, and the enduring mythologizing of their sons. Ellen Kelly's quiet endurance reminded Australians that the human cost of rebellion extended far beyond the man in iron, touching mothers, siblings, and entire communities. Even as urbanization transformed landscapes, the bush retained its power as a repository of memory. Trails, ridges, and creeks serve as silent witnesses. Modern visitors might see only green hills and winding tracks, but the stories persisted, embedded in the place, carried by wind through trees, remembered in speech and song. The land itself was a living archive, a medium through which the past whispered to the present. Ned Kelly's story remained a lens through which Australians examined broader themes: the tension between law and individual freedom, the consequences of systemic injustice, the price of standing against authority. It posed uncomfortable questions. When is rebellion justified? How much defiance is too much? And what is the human cost of resistance? These questions, still unresolved, ensure that the story remained vital, relevant, and compelling. The legend also revealed the duality of memory. Heroism could coexist with violence, bravery with recklessness, loyalty with destruction. Audiences, scholars, and ordinary citizens grapple with these contradictions, recognizing that the truth of a life is often messy, resistant to simplification. History, memory, and myth intertwined, creating a narrative that was both moral and cautionary. The iron armor, the derailed train, the smoke of Glenrowan, they were enduring symbols. Yet the human reality behind them was more profound. A man forced to make impossible choices, aware of danger, yet driven by loyalty, pride, and a desire for justice. That reality, even when obscured by legend, was the core of the story. It reminded Australians that courage is inseparable from consequence, that defiance carries cost, and that history is always lived as human experience before it is remembered as myth. As the century progressed, Ned Kelly's story persisted not as simple entertainment, but as reflection. It prompted dialogue, introspection, and understanding. It challenged readers, viewers, and listeners to confront the complexities of morality, authority, and resistance. His life, though violent and brief, became an enduring mirror of the human condition, reflecting both our capacity for courage and our vulnerability to consequence. Through all reinterpretations, through every book, film, song, and museum exhibit, the man behind the myth remained present, if elusive. His choices, his courage, and his tragedy resonated because they were rooted in reality, the lived experience of human confronting impossible odds. And while the legend of Ned Kelly might continue to grow, the truth of the man remained grounded. A boy shaped by circumstance, a man forced to fight, and a life marked by consequence. Even today, standing at the quiet remnants of Glenrowan, one can imagine the clash of iron, the flare of gunfire, the smoke curling into the night sky. The land holds memory, and so do the stories carried through generations. Ned Kelly's legacy endures in both place and imagination, a complex, human tale of courage, defiance, and consequence that refuses to fade, reminding each generation of the weight and cost of standing against the world. By the time the 20th century had fully settled into its stride, the legend of Ned Kelly had become inseparable from the Australian consciousness. He was no longer just a bushranger or a criminal. He was a mirror through which Australians examined courage, defiance, and the consequences of standing against overwhelming power. The life he had lived, brief and violent, continued to provoke reflection, debate, and fascination. Glenrowan, once a stage of chaos and blood, had returned to quiet. Trains passed smoothly along rebuilt rails. The inn lay in ruins long ago replaced by ordinary buildings. The bush regrew, softening the scars of gunfire and fire. Yet the memory lingered in the ridges, the gullies, and the creeks, the silent witnesses to history. Locals could trace the gang's movements with uncanny precision, pointing out where horses had been watered, where ambushes were staged, and where the final stand had unfolded. Children grew up hearing tales of iron plates ringing against bullets, of bravery and folly intertwined, of lives forever changed by one man's choices. In museums, Ned Kelly's armor remained the focal point of attention. Visitors marveled at its weight, the ingenious yet imperfect design, the dents and scars marking encounters with bullets. Standing before it, One could almost feel the strain of his shoulders beneath its weight, the narrow slit of vision restricting the world to a small line of hope and danger. It was more than a relic. It was a tangible embodiment of courage, desperation, and human ingenuity. And yet, behind the metal lay a human being who felt fear, loyalty, love, and regret. Cultural representations of Kelly continued to evolve. Films, stage plays, novels, and ballads interpreted him variously as hero, villain, or something in between. Each retelling reflected not only his story, but the values of the era. Audiences cheered his audacity, condemned his violence, or reflected on the moral complexity of his choices. Scholars analyzed his letters and court transcripts, parsing motive, intent, and consequence. The debates were endless, yet that very ambiguity ensured the story endured. For the descendants of those involved, the police officers who had died at Stringy Bark Creek, the members of the Kelly family, the story remained deeply personal. Mourning was quiet, lives lived in the shadow of history. Yet the broader public fascination did not erase the grief or the moral weight of the events. Ellen Kelly's resilience and the losses her family endured reminded Australians that courage often carries a devastating cost, not only to those who act, but to those who love them. Ned Kelly's story also became a lens through which Australians examined justice, authority, and societal fairness. It raised uncomfortable questions. How far can man be pushed before he resists? When does rebellion become inevitability? What is the human cost of defiance? These questions transcended time and place, relevant to generations confronting their own struggles with law, morality, and power. Even as urbanization transformed the landscape, the bush preserved memory. Trails, ridges, and waterways carried the past like a living archive, the wind rustling through ironbark leaves. The quiet of creek or the shadowed hollows of ridges could evoke the presence of the past. Visitors often paused in silence, sensing the weight of history beneath their feet. The bush did not forget, and in its quiet persistence, it told stories no textbook could fully capture. The moral ambiguity of Kelly's life remained central to his enduring fascination. He was capable of empathy and violence, strategy and recklessness, loyalty and cruelty. His life defied simple categorization. Courage existed alongside consequence, defiance alongside tragedy. This complexity ensured that the story was never merely entertainment. It was reflection, teaching, and warning all at once. Through decades of retelling, analysis, and dramatization, Ned Kelly endured as both man and symbol. The armor, the gunfire, the derailed train. They were physical markers of a moment in history, but the human story behind them gave them power. A boy shaped by circumstance, a man forced into desperate action, a figure who confronted the impossible. These truths resonated across time, shaping how Australians understood heroism, morality, and consequence. By the close of the century, his life had become inseparable from questions about human nature. Courage and recklessness, morality and survival, authority and rebellion. They were all visible in his choices. His story reminded the nation that history is not composed solely of victories or defeats, but of decisions made under pressure, and the ripples those decisions create across families, communities, and generations. Standing today at Glenrowan, one can almost hear it. The distant whistle of the train that never left the track as intended, the echo of bullets striking iron, the hurried whispers of men and horses moving through the night. The land itself holds memory, teaching that history is not only written in books but lived in place, felt in air and soil, carried through generations. Ned Kelly's legacy is enduring because it compels reflection. It forces Australians to ask difficult questions. How far will one go for justice? When does courage cross into recklessness? What is the cost of standing against overwhelming odds? These questions remain open-ended, just as the man behind the armor remains enigmatic, human, fallible, brilliant, and tragic. In the final measure, the story of Ned Kelly is not about heroism or villainy alone. It is about consequence, courage, and the weight of choice. It is about how a single life, lived in defiance of circumstance, can echo through time, shaping culture, identity, and morality. The bush may have regrown, the tracks may hum with modern trains, and they may have vanished, but the story endures, alive in memory, preserved in artifacts, and carried forward in the questions it leaves behind. Such is the life and legacy of Ned Kelly, a man who dared to challenge authority, a figure encased in ire and myth, whose story continues to demand reflection on courage, sacrifice, and the price of defiance. The bullets have long since silenced, but the questions remain, and as long as they are asked, his story will endure,